All right, let's go ahead and get started. This is the March, crazy, Data and Performance Management Committee meeting. Welcome, everyone. I made slides mostly just for the first agenda item, so they're kind of sad, but we're going to talk about some new fields that the Domestic Violence Task Force had discussed adding to HMIS. And then I'll be handing it over to Connor for a presentation on the inequity dashboard that their agency has created and is kind of using and dabbling in. And then we will go over the homeless prevention project performance reports. And as a reminder, this meeting is meant to kind of be a discussion, so feel free to jump in with any questions or comments. If you're not able to speak, try to call in if you can, or if not, you can always participate in the chat box. So the first item, the Domestic Violence Task Force fields, say that 5 times fast. So some background first, this came up because they had requested some data from the HMIS team about DV clients in HMIS. And we provided it and we were talking through it, and they felt that there would be a benefit to collecting some more information from the clients that have experienced domestic violence. They were hoping to add these fields to HMIS. Their request was for all projects. So this would impact your projects in HMIS as well. And they were hoping to eventually be able to do reporting on this data once the data has been entered into HMIS for a little while. And they were thinking that the benefit would be additional funding over time, because we were able to demonstrate how many clients are experiencing or have experienced domestic violence. And I invited Soledad to be here to kind of help out with this, and I don't see her so far.
Here.
Oh, you are. Hi. Do you want to add anything, Soledad?
Sorry, I'm gonna get out and go back in. I'm having a little issues. We had a little issue here, but I'll come back in 1 second. Probably.
Okay. So while we're waiting for Soledad to come back and she can add additional context, the 2 fields that they had requested to add was, first, is domestic violence a cause of your homelessness? And the answer options are, it's a main cause of homelessness, it is one of the causes of homelessness, or it is not a cause of homelessness. And the second question is child abuse a cause of your homelessness, with the same answer options. So Soledad, are you back yet?
Yeah, I'm here. I just, for some reason, my screen is not opening completely, but I don't know what's going on.
Well, do you want to, did that kind of cover what the need is, or do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so mainly we want to make sure we are able to obtain this data as to support later on some of the victims, I'm sorry, not the victims, but the survivors of domestic violence, and understand a little bit better, how many are homeless because of domestic violence is something that we don't have a clear picture on, and be able to later on also advocate for more funding for some of the programs that support the survivors of domestic violence and sexual abuse as well. So that's kind of the idea. As we have this task force and we continue to, this is the data subcommittee that was doing some studies and trying to gather all this information. We're very thankful to Erin and her team for being able to provide us with that. So that's kind of why we're looking for it in a bigger picture per se.
And these questions would be collected on the enrollment screen. So as part of your standard enrollment questions. And I was thinking that these questions would only appear if the client answered yes to Are you a survivor of domestic violence? So if they answered no, you just wouldn't see these questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to open it up to the group to share your thoughts on adding these fields. They wouldn't be part of any data quality stuff that we do, like with the data quality report cards, those, it wouldn't impact you there if the information was not collected. But this could be helpful with future funding opportunities, which is the main reason for wanting to add these fields.
I have a question. Are you anticipating that these questions are asked in terms of the most immediate experience with homelessness or historic and immediate experience with homelessness?
I was thinking the current episode of homelessness, but Soledad, you can.
Yeah, I think to make it easy, we'll have to be the most current because we go work on when we pull the data and the data is being pulled, you're looking at the latest enrollment. So that's kind of what we were thinking. Obviously, the more information we can get, the better. And if we can get it from prior to that, but we don't want to make it confusing and more difficult to obtain.
And I got a question, would these fields be added to the enrollment forms? We would add them since they would be applicable to all projects. So we would add those to our paper forms. Would this, oh, go ahead, Connor.
I'm just curious, how are, oh, hi, Soledad, good to see you too. She sent me a direct message. Hi, Connor, good to see you. Anyway, sorry to put you on blast. I'm wondering, how are you planning on these answers being differentiated from, are you currently fleeing? Because it's my understanding of the question, are you currently fleeing, that the assumption there is that their homelessness is caused by domestic violence.
Well, because we were trying to make a differentiation with some people are fleeing, but they're not necessarily homeless to begin with, you know? And so could be that they could go to live with friends or family, which according to HUD, they wouldn't be considered necessarily homeless. So they have other options. So when they go to a shelter and they have no other resources, that's kind of what we were looking at. And again, this is just different people in the group. A lot of the people part of the group are members of the different shelters, domestic violence shelter as well. So we're trying to see what makes more sense to gather more information. It seems to be too broad with some of the questions we currently have.
So unless I've misunderstood the definition of literal homelessness, if you're fleeing domestic violence, you do count as literally homeless, regardless of where you're currently residing. So I don't, I guess I didn't follow the logic there as to how this would be differentiated from the other one. I'm also concerned, and I know this is just a particular case I'm referencing, but I think it's an indicative example. We have I once did an HMIS intake on an older woman who had been homeless for a very long time and had profound mental health problems, who was under the impression that she was fleeing domestic violence as a result of paranoia from a symptom from her mental health problem, whereas she had been homeless for literally decades consecutively. So the data, I'm wondering how the data we'd be getting from this question would be better and more reliable than the, are you currently fleeing? Because I want you guys to get your funding, and I want us to get good data too.
Exactly. No, and I get what you're saying, because I think for many people, they're not necessarily part of HMIS, which some of the members of the task force are not. They were not, and Erin came to our meeting, and Erin can corroborate on that, that when she came to our meeting, she explained that if you're fleeing, you're considered homeless, which I knew that, but not everybody, you know, somebody from legal aid or other agencies are part of our team. That was not common to them to understand. So yes, so some of the questions came out as conversations trying to understand the whole process, understanding what, you know, coordinating entry is and coordinating what the process is and how does that include everybody, how they're not in HMIS, but some people are and some people are not, and your DV. So trying to gather all that information. So that's what that came from, trying to make a differentiation, but to some of the data that we were provided by 211 is how do we get a little bit more specific into understanding that group? It still seems to be very broad, because even with the VSPDAT, you know, some of the questions are so, are you fleeing? I can't remember now, I had it somewhere. But, you know, because somebody assaulted you, somebody, you left domestic violence, because you had a fight with somebody. It goes totally in the opposite direction. So it's hard to pinpoint the reason that that person became homeless.
Just to jump in, I would argue that the current fleeing question is a bit confusing because most people are in the shelters if they're fleeing domestic violence because they have fled. It implies that you're actively trying to flee an abuser, whereas was your homelessness caused by domestic violence is much more clear in how active the situation is. It doesn't confuse an active ongoing circumstance with domestic violence as a cause of homelessness.
I also got another question. And Jackie just reminded me, if you haven't already, please put your agency name in the chat. I just jumped right in. And then I got a question on the child abuse question. Is it intended to be asked of minors or the head of household?
No, head of household.
Okay.
Yeah.
So would it make sense to, is that going to be confusing if you're asking the head of household if child abuse is a cause of your homelessness?
And again, those are things that we're still discussing. I think you were there, Aaron, when we were going back and forth in some of the questions. That came out as the most, of all the possibilities, the most easier, if I want to call it easy to ask. But obviously, we don't want to traumatize any children by asking those questions. So there's still back and forth in some of those situations of, sexual abuse. I think we talked more about the sexual abuse and that as well. But those are questions that we can still kind of finesse a little bit more.
Just one thought that I have in regards to the child abuse question is really our role also as mandated reporters, and asking that question and what the next steps would be that would come out of them disclosing that maybe child abuse was a cause of their homelessness, and just what maybe some of those next steps or recommendations, or if anything has been thought about in terms of how that question would be answered and what we're supposed to do with that, not only in terms of data collection, but really as being mandated reporters as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. That's also something that we need to know. And obviously the question will be the follow-up, how long ago? Is it anybody working with you? What has been done about it? And those kinds of things. But that's more left to the trauma-informed care conversation than, too many questions.
So then just a follow-up to that is this presentation right now just getting like initial thoughts on it? Is it really, are we at the point where like if everyone has good feelings about it, that this would be implemented, or what is the timeline that is going behind when those questions would potentially be finalized and added?
I'll leave that to Aaron, but I think the main point was to bring that to the group to see their opinions. And then obviously we'll have to go through the county and get the county. I have some questions and actually some information for Jocelyn, as I see her in the in the chat as well. But going that way first as well.
Yeah, I think we wanted. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was actually going to ask, and I don't know if it would be an offline conversation or not, but how did this question come to be? And if you could share maybe who the task force is, so we can have a general idea of who's having these conversations, just to kind of get some background on it.
Mm-hmm. So for the task force, we have a big group of over 52 agencies are part of it, and then they're part of the the Family Violence Council. And so it's made out of service providers. We have DVD, again, shelters, providers. We have law agencies. We have faith organizations. There's a lot of them, but I'm not the chair, so I'm just giving you the information that I have. But we also have a subcommittee, which is the data subcommittee. And for that, a member, the chair is Wendy Seiden. She's from Chapman University, and she's from the School of Law and from the Aiken Family Protection Clinic. So she's the chair of that. For the task force and for the data committee, we have Helen Cameron from Jamboree, Judy Rose from Human Options, Nabri Dallowell from WTLC, Eve Guerra from ACLU, Yerim Rosa from Waymakers, and Lillian Hoyas from Waymaker, and myself. So we're part of the data subcommittee. And so that came about, oh gosh, I want to say we've been doing meetings for about 2 years now, if not longer. And it was a conversation, how do we not separate from it, but we integrate more of this information into what the COC is doing, into what coordinating entry is, and understanding a little bit more of how do we support, because the data is not there. Every time you talk to the DV shelters, you know, it's like we can't input them in HMIS. And I know when I was at the collaborative, that's one of the initiatives I started, is to make sure we connected those DV shelters into HMIS, and how do we connect them with one of the access points to get that information entered in HMIS. But since we don't have all of it, how do we start bringing that information in order for us to support those projects and really, really having a better view of what the needs are right now and what's causing a lot of the people that are in the DV shelters? Is it their homelessness? You know, is it DV, or in general? Obviously, if you're in the DV shelter, it's DV. But if in general, you know, some people have gone to coordinating entry and we don't know if that was the cause that they became homeless or not, because by the time they get the coordinating entry, we just don't have that information necessarily. They have gone to too many projects by then.
I think that I'm pondering on Connor's initial statement about if we're already collecting that information and if we're just not doing a good job inferring information from the data we're already collecting. But I do also agree with John. Sometimes those questions can get confusing. So I don't know if it's a matter of training and then using the information we're already asking, because then we would have years of that information, or like what different are we going to be getting from this particular set of questions? For example, we don't ask, is it the main cause of homelessness one of the causes, not a cause? And obviously that would be self-certified response, which with most of everything that we collect. But I guess in my perception of the questions on the HMIS intake, this is the same as Connor was inferring. So yeah, I'm still trying to think about like how this is different.
Mm-hmm. I think for us, it's just more specific, because it seems like, as John was saying, a lot of them are either could be misleading or they're too broad. So when you request data, it doesn't specify when you're asking. It's just too broad. When we receive the data, which was great and we appreciate it and give us a view of it, even when we requested just to separate it by gender, that was kind of, wow, then you really can see what's out there. But again, remember, that's not the whole data. That's just what's in HMIS.
I was trying to come up kind of with a compromise between using the existing fleeing DV field and trying to get more information. But it might be really invasive, and I don't know if a client would be into it, but like if they said, are you fleeing? Yes, and then a follow-up question about like, what are you fleeing? But like I said, it makes me uncomfortable even mentioning.
Yeah.
I also got a question. Is the child abuse question intended to suggest an adult member was abusing a child in the household?
No.
So where would the child abuse be coming from?
I wish Wendy was here, because a lot of it has been done before in some of the questions. But that was my understanding. I was more focused on the DV one, and they were focused more on the child abuse and sexual abuse part of it. So I can get you some more background on that as well.
I'd just like to add, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the child abuse question, not because it's not information that I think it's important to know for the safety of children, but we have specialized projects like specialized DV projects because they have staff that are skilled, trained in that type of work. And though we do take the 40-hour training and things like that, we're not equipped to handle if that opens Pandora's box that we're not ready for. That makes me really nervous for our team. So I think that whether these questions are good or not, I think I would love to hear if there's like some kind of support that we could tap into immediately if we open up something that we're not equipped to address. And I think that's the main thing that is concerning about the child abuse question.
No, thank you, because all these comments I will bring back to the DV task force committee, the data subcommittee, so that way they hear, we're just so into our own situation at the moment that you're not hearing from outside. So it's always good, especially when there's a lot of people that that's their life, but it isn't understanding the HMIS part. So it's a compromise of bringing both of them together. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
I have another question. Is the DV Task Force Committee really committed to these questions, or would they be open to maybe changing the style of questions slightly if the Data Committee or the Policies, Procedures, and Standards Committee wish to do so?
I know that it's taken several meetings to get to this basic questions, but obviously it's always a conversation. I don't think anybody's just gonna go, oh my gosh, this is it, and we're not going to be open to anything else. But I think it took a while to center it. And I know, again, Aaron was there kind of one of the last meetings we had, and kind of everybody going back and forth, what's the best way and what do we need to know and how do we get it? Mm-hmm. So for us, it's more, we know what we need to know, but how do we word the question that is appropriate within the HMIS requirements for us to be able to pull the data?
Okay.
Would it be helpful if instead of these questions, it was more like, would you like to receive support, or would you be interested in support for any of the following things, and then list like resources or something, like, because what Rose is saying, you don't want to open Pandora's box and not be able to help someone. But if there was like certain resources related to domestic violence that we know of or are able to refer to, that might soften it and also help kind of with what the need is.
I mean, I can see, I know they were more into wanting to know more specific, because again, a lot of what we have is too broad to really understand and pinpoint and focus on what we need to know in order to support. And one of the concerns, if I recall correctly, from one of the members or a couple of the members, was some of the people that are in shelters, if you don't ask those questions, you don't really know specifically what's going on with them regarding the DV situation. So I think that was more focused towards some of the shelters as well. And we were talking to the different shelters, so if they had different intake forms separate than what HMIS had, do they ask those questions? How do they ask those questions? How do they know? Not necessarily, a domestic violence shelter, but the regular shelters, like Yale or anything like that. And we've been meeting with some of them to have conversations just to see how those questions or that information is being processed, or the way to obtain it.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Rose. No, sorry.
I think that if we ask the question, have you experienced domestic violence? Are you currently fleeing? And then if those like trigger, like Aaron was saying, we ask something along the lines of that you have here, but it's like, is this domestic violence experience or whatever the wording cause of your recent homelessness? And then those follow down questions. I like that.
Yeah.
The word recent, because it seems a little bit broad right now. I'm still not comfortable with the child abuse question.
Mm-hmm.
And if I may, I don't know if you can hear me. Can you guys hear me? This is Christine from Orange County Housing.
Yeah.
Awesome. Kind of tagging on to what Rose is saying, but forgive me for one, not being a little bit ignorant because I don't work directly with clients, right? I'm pure data. So I'm pure HMIS. I don't know Connor very well, but I think I'm in the same vein as Connor a lot of times on these things. But my biggest concern is we're housing, right? So we'll get these intakes and we put them in, you know, as we're going off the forms because now obviously we're not meeting with the clients directly. So we're kind of going off their self. But if they say yes, or if we dig deeper, I would presume it implies that we have services for them. You know, it's kind of like when you ask somebody a question, you know, how you doing? I'm doing horrible. Oh, really? What's going on? It's kind of now you're involved, right? Now you got to know. Or are we now putting ourselves, because we are mandated reporters, learning a piece of information that we weren't really inclined to ask because it doesn't relate to their eligibility for housing per se. So I'm uncomfortable with this, to be honest.
Okay.
I just want to piggyback off of what Christine just said really quickly. I think I can definitely see a benefit to asking questions about domestic violence. There's no question about that. Domestic violence is a cause for sure of homelessness. We already collect information about domestic violence. I think one thing that we would want to be mindful of, though, when adding additional questions is what purpose is that serving for us as homeless service providers? And are we adding these questions for the purposes of collecting data in our community? And is that going to pay off in the sense of these other doors that we're opening for ourselves in terms of the data that we are collecting? So I think that we collect a lot of data. I know that for the Family Coordinated Entry System project enrollment, we do ask questions about what has caused their homeless situation. And so I think that that's just one thing to be mindful of, is that as homeless service providers and having a database like HMIS, where we do all share information, I think that a lot of times we're going to be asked to add questions because it's convenient and it's a way to collect data at a community level. And at the same time, I think that I think it's important for us to consider the purposes behind why we're collecting this. And if it serves a purpose for us as homeless service providers to be asking these specific questions.
That's the whole purpose of the questions. The questions is not just to collect data. We need the data in order to be able to provide the services and the support. If you don't have it in any grant or anything like that, it's not going to happen. But if you don't have that data first, you cannot do it. So that's the purpose of it. It wouldn't be just to collect data because we just need to collect data. But we have realized that a lot of the questions being asked, like even in the intake form from the collaborative, is very vague. You know, what caused your current your homeless situation? It could be anything, and it's not something that goes in there because people just talk and you just write it, but it's not an answer that you can put in HMIS for it. So HMIS had those direct questions. The VSPRATs had somewhat questions, but the other forms do not have specific questions. So that's what we're looking for. We looked at, you know, HMIS, VSPRAT, the FSC intake form. So where will those questions be a little bit more specific? And the only one is clearly more defined as HMIS, but the other ones are not. So that's what we're looking for.
And I can completely understand the perspective that you're coming from, Soledad. I mean, like I said before, I prefaced what I said as understanding that domestic violence and the causes of homelessness are important information for us to collect. I think that in regards to these specific questions, though, maybe this is a question that could be answered at a later time, but once we collect this information, what are we supposed to be doing with that? Like what follow-up if someone says it is a main cause, then is there an expectation that certain action is taken because that data is being collected? And so I think that when we ask the question, are you fleeing domestic violence, and someone answers yes, then of course there is clear action that we would want to take by connecting to a domestic violence provider. At the same time, asking questions in this way, if it is a main cause, like, is that still the same expectation that's coming out of these questions? Or is it just strictly limited to the data in our community and the causes of homelessness in our community? And that may be a perfectly valid reason to ask a question. I'm not saying it's not, but I do think that as part of this initial conversation, it is important for us to be asking kind of what would take place after asking these questions and collecting that data.
The response should be the same. You know, if anybody tells you, you know, I'm being abused, obviously you're gonna call, or child's being abused, you're gonna call Child Protective Services. I think it doesn't matter how the question is put there. If the answer is something that we're all being trained to react and know we have to do, the response will have to be the same. So
and so then I just kind of go back to like what Rose or Christine said about our training and the capacity that we all have, and if that's something that we are well equipped to be handling. So I'm just going to leave it at that. And I'll definitely, I know that there's several other people who've unmuted themselves, so I'm going to let them go ahead and talk.
Sure.
From a grant writing perspective, having this information can be incredibly helpful for getting the funds that are needed to provide those specific services. I know that, for instance, there are questions that aren't required by HUD that Mercy House just elects not to ask. For instance, sexual orientation. We don't apply for LGBT specific grants, so we don't collect that information. However, in Soledad's case, I could see that as being useful. And I think that that tool could be helpful to her. And if agencies do not need that specific information, they could elect just to not ask it.
Soledad, in the grants that you're looking to be awarded funds for, are they specifically asking like the percentage of families homeless because of child abuse, or like how is it being worded?
That I'm not, I don't want to lie because I don't really know that part of the grant, because when it does all that, I know that that was a concern that came out of, again, when we had the first meetings, and then that's what this data committee was, subcommittee was formed, because there was so much data that was missing, or we were not, it wasn't really, I wouldn't say readily available, because you actually do provide it to us, but not a specific data that we were looking for to understand the magnitude of homelessness being caused because of domestic violence and child abuse. So that's kind of where we went through, but I can ask, again, there's a lot of things that I can ask the chair to give us some more information about.
Yeah,
Another question. Oh, sorry, Aaron. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it might be helpful to like get an example or something
Yeah.
of what's being asked to kind of help craft this conversation. Go ahead, Cassie.
So I feel like everybody's that's spoken up about this has said it kind of in, you know, the same thing in many different ways, but in regards to the child abuse question, who is actually asking, like, if there's a family, say like, you know, they answer no to the domestic violence thing, and then, you know, moving on to this child abuse question, like, who's asking the child? Like, the family's not going to admit necessarily that like they're abusing their children, but nobody's asking the child in that case. So I don't know how like how great that data is going to be if there even is child abuse.
Yeah.
I can see this happening, like this being a great question to ask in like a RIE programs, but I don't know how well the collection of this data is going to go in that regard.
No, and I understand that. That again, to me, that's a very touchy subject, but it came all together as a one thing, because that's all part of what we do and we are. But it's always a conversation on that. But I agree with you, Cassie.
Does that question, the child abuse question, just to get to Cassie's point, imply that the abuser that the adult was fleeing is the same person who abused the child? Is that what that question is trying to get at? Otherwise, I totally get her point.
No, my understanding from that question, again, like I said, I wasn't part of that committee, was that they wanted to know if that person, that adult, but that's the part that I was kind of confused too, if it was when they were children and that caused them to have all these issues through their life. How did that come about?
So I think that we got a lot of good feedback, and
Yeah.
maybe Soledad, the next step is for you to take the feedback back to the DV task force, and then They can talk amongst themselves and then maybe come back with some edits. So maybe we'll leave it there unless anybody has anything else they want to add before we move on.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And then, Aaron, I'll connect with you as well to maybe connect with the DV task force too. I apologize, Wendy wanted to be here today, but she's been ill, so she couldn't. So we'll continue to move forward. And I appreciate everybody's opinion for sure.
Okay, great.
Thank you. I'm gonna have to go.
Thanks, Soledad.
Bye.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Connor, do you want to share your screen for the dashboard?
Yeah. Do you need to make me a co-host? Yeah, you definitely
Probably.
need to make me a co-host.
You should be able to now.
Cool. 1 second. Okay. All right. I made a brief slideshow introduction just to show kind of how we got here. Can everyone see that? I cannot see or hear anyone anymore, but that's great. Y'all disappeared from the screen. Cool. I can hear you now. Yes. Oh, I've got a lot of yeses. Thank you so much. So anyway, we're going to be showing y'all the equity dashboard that we made. So we're talking about analyzing outcomes based on demographic criteria, particularly performance outcomes in HMIS. So kind of the history of this project, about 3 years ago, we at Friendship Shelter started to get curious about whether there was a correlation between people of different races, ethnicities, or other demographic features and performance outcomes. The questions we went into this with are all people being served equitably, right? That's kind of the baseline question. And one of the questions we got in response to that, and especially in response to our early findings, is to what degree are external factors expected to influence outcomes? I know that's a kind of weird way of phrasing it, but and I'm not saying I agree with this line of thinking either, but it's a question that I heard in response sometimes. So I think an example is, right, if systemic racism is a real thing, then is it our responsibility to ensure that we achieve the same outcomes for people who may be victims of systemic racism, where it might be harder to find them a place to live as a result of that? Again, I don't agree with that line of thinking. I think it's inherently flawed, but it's a question we got back when we brought up achieving equitable outcomes when disaggregating by race, ethnicity, or other demographic features. And then, so if we find inequitable outcomes, what do we do about it? I don't really answer that question in this, but I think it's the big question on everybody's mind. So my first attempt at kind of analyzing, disaggregating these performance outcomes by race and ethnicity was very simple and kind of brute force. I literally just took race and ethnicity and did them intersectionally. So if you reported being Hispanic or Latino in HMIS, I put that on the same chart with the races because it wasn't useful to have ethnicity as entirely separate. And then just put the number of successful outcomes in on the y-axis here. I know this is really blurry because this is from a report that I apparently had only saved as a PDF. So you might not be able to read this, but people who are Hispanic or Latino are this really small bar over here. And people who are Asian are this larger bar over here, which seems to imply that we were providing much more adequate services for people who are Asian, white, Black, Pacific Islander than we were for people who reported being multiracial or Hispanic. Now, if you're really into statistics like I am, you're also looking at this and seeing that our methodology is inherently flawed for a lot of reasons. So this was not the best way to look at the data. And we realized that after I had kind of made this chart and presented this to the program managers, and got feedback that I needed to go back to the drawing board. So the second attempt, I didn't make a chart or a graph. I just gave the program managers kind of cards like this. And these are, again, race and ethnicity added. And then this is people experiencing homelessness on the street who are accessing our day program. This is people who are in shelter, so the percentage of people of each race or ethnicity. And then this is people who exited that shelter into housing. And you can see a drastic whitening of the population is here with street homelessness. We have about 67% of people experiencing homelessness on the street are white, whereas about 81% of the people achieving a successful housing outcome were white. So this seemed to imply that there's some kind of funnel effect. But again, got a lot of questions back from program managers and leadership on what this means and whether or not the results we were finding were statistically relevant, because I didn't include some key information here like sample sizes or reporting periods that would make this easier to glean findings from. So my third attempt, which is still not the one I'm going to be showing you guys today, but the third attempt here is I went to NHSDC, which, by the way, if you haven't been to the National Human Services Data Consortium conference, it will change your life. I love it there. But I went to NHSDC and I watched Jesse Jorstad, a hero of mine, show off his equity dashboard. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. The one thing that he drove home more than anything is we should limit the variables that we're comparing at one time, which makes perfect sense, right? So instead of comparing people of all races and ethnicities alongside each other, why don't we compare people who report being Latinx next to people who do not report being Latinx, right? People who are Asian next to people who do not report being Asian, and see if this variable, single variable, seems to be affecting achieving housing outcomes. So that's what we did. And this is an example of a page from that static report. So they were just, images, not a dashboard, but we seem to find some compelling findings, right? And and I put sample sizes on everything. So these are sample sizes here. So we can see the sample sizes are statistically valid. It's over 30 people, which is kind of a good rule of thumb. Still wasn't quite good enough because this is aggregating all of our successes, quote, across a bunch of different types of programs and trying to compare street outreach with permanent supportive housing all at one time through like multiple definitions of success, which is a little bit haphazard. So that brings us to the current iteration of this dashboard that I am here to show off today. I'm going to go ahead and open this up in Tableau Public, which means I need to stop sharing my screen for just a second. I'm having fun. I hope you guys are too, because I feel like I'm just talking to myself.
Connor, we are having fun knowing that you are having so much fun.
That's what I like to hear, if, yeah, that's
we miss
good.
you, Connor. We miss you.
Connor is out here living his best life.
Oh God, I thought he was gonna cry for a minute.
I think Cassie remembers that one time I shed a tear at the data meeting while trying to give a compelling, whatever. Back to the dashboard.
It was great. It was a great soapbox moment for you.
Thanks, Cassie. I miss all of you guys a lot. So can you guys see this dashboard? Am I sharing the right screen?
Yeah, you're good.
That's great. Okay, so then I made this thing, which I am well aware kind of looks like you're trying to land a plane. This is not the prettiest dashboard in the world, but it gets a lot done in one place. So I'm going to kind of walk us through these filters and then the charts, and we'll get to look at some of the findings. So the first filter is a parameter called demographic group. And here I've put all sorts of demographics into this parameter. So we can look at people who are Latinx, Native American, Asian, Black, multiracial, but also like gender minority. The sample sizes were too small for people who were trans or gender nonconforming to try to disaggregate by different, within those categories. So I just lumped it all into gender minority, which I am well aware is not the best way to do it, but is better than having no findings at all. transitional aged youth. So we have a bunch of different demographic categories so that we're not just focusing on race and ethnicity. And what this parameter changes is the in-group and out-group. So if we look at the scatter plot here, the X indicates the in-group. So the in-group is the group that you selected in the parameter, and the O indicates the out-group. So in this case, the X indicates all people who reported being Latinx in HMIS, whereas the O indicates everyone who did not report being Latinx in HMIS. And then the x-axis here is the quote success rate, which again is a compilation of success across all sorts of different programs. So it coerces the definition of success down to just a binary like a Boolean true false, right? So in a street outreach program, that's basically if you went to anywhere that wasn't the street. In a permanent supportive housing program, success just means you stayed there or you left to somewhere else that was housing as well. So success is defined differently for every program, but this dashboard accounts for that and just converts it all down to true or false. And so the success rate is the percentage of the people who are enrollments, pardon me, who achieved a successful outcome during their stay in the program. And then here is recidivism. I don't really like the term recidivism because I think it has criminal justice implications, but what we're talking about is returns to homelessness, which was just a little too lengthy to try to fit on this y-axis. And I flipped the axis for recidivism so that 100% is down in the lower left-hand corner. The reason that I did that is I wanted lower left-hand corner to be the poorest possible outcome and upper right-hand corner to be the best possible outcome, so that your brain doesn't have to do any like flipperoni in your head. So the goal obviously is for both of these dots to be as far away from the lower left-hand corner as possible, and for both of them to be as close to each other as possible. So with the in-group being set to Latinx, we can see that the outcomes are marginally worse for people who reported being Latinx than for people who did not report being Latinx. They seem to achieve we seem to achieve a success rate in serving them at a lower rate than we do with people who are not Latinx. And we seem to consistently place people who report being Latinx in housing situations which may be more unstable or less sustainable for them. And therefore they are returning to homelessness at a higher rate. So that's how to read this chart in a basic way. To drill down deeper, let's say I am a program manager and I just want to see for my program. So let's say I am the program manager of the bridge housing program. Annalisa is going to be very upset that I'm putting her on blast like this. But here we move it, and it actually seems that over time, so we have a start date and an end date, all the way back to January 1st of 2010, which is well before we had data in HMIS. So all this is saying is forever, and an end date of September 30th of 2020, which is the last time I updated the dashboard. We can see if we take all people we've ever served who reported being Latinx, we achieved slightly higher success rates, but with pretty drastically higher returns to homelessness rates. Now, because a constant or a frequent feedback to the other attempts I had made at analyzing this kind of data was that the sample sizes weren't there. We couldn't be sure if the findings were statistically relevant. All of these reasons that the findings didn't matter. So down here, I just included some good raw numbers of number of enrollments, number of people served, average enrollments per person, which I think is an interesting one. And the point of all of this data is with this stuff down in the lower left-hand corner, you could actually run like statistical t-tests to see if your findings are actually statistically relevant based on the population size. So that's how the dashboard works. I have a little bit of a deeper dive I can take y'all on how I made it. But does anyone have any questions so far? Splendid. So just, just a little bit on how I made it. I'm not going to totally nerd out, but here it is I guess I've already totally nerded out. And Y'all are just along for the ride, but they asked me to present this and I'm going to present it. So this is the thing in Tableau. I'm going to assume I'm sharing the right window. And if I'm not, just let me know. But so here it is in Tableau. If I unhide the sheets, I can actually go to the scatter plot, the bars, and the table that I made. And I can look at the parameters and calculated fields. So a lot of these calculations are from different visualizations that I've made. So if you're familiar with Tableau, I'm not using even half of these in this. It's actually a very simple dashboard with just a bunch of clutter in it. But the bread and butter of how this disaggregates is in the parameter here. So I have a parameter where you can change the indicated demographic groups, right? And I just wrote them all in as values and display as. And then that links up with a case statement called group. And the case statement just coerces these down into binary values. So it's just a 1 or actually a null. I could have done a 0 if I wanted to be more semantically correct. But it's like if I've selected Latinx and the client's ethnicity is Hispanic or Latino, then 1. Else if, you get the idea. The only one that was a little tricky is there's an else if or for gender minority, because that includes people who are trans or gender nonconforming. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of how that calculation worked there on the back end. And then I put that into filters. And I put group in the fields and added aliases to the group so that the 1 displays as in group and the null displays as out group. And I also have, that's kind of unimportant, but getting the date filters into the parameters was kind of tricky and totally irrelevant to what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to nerd out that bad and show you guys how I made the date parameters. But that's what it looks like on the back end. We haven't yet, one more thing to share my screen on. So back to my PowerPoint, and then I'll land the plane here so y'all can stop listening to me talk. But there are 2 known issues with the way that I laid this out. So recidivism, I kind of calculated the lazy man's way. I didn't include the date that the individual returned to homelessness. So what that means is the farther back in time the time period goes, the more the risk of a return to homelessness being indicated by the dashboard increases. Obviously, that's not prime. My goal is to add in the recidivism range as a parameter. But I just haven't had the time to do that. This is maybe not my most pressing issue at work. So we just remember that that's how it's working. Also, success rate for permanent supportive housing outcomes is not filtering out people who exited outside of the selected date range. So if, let's say I'm only looking at the year 2017 and someone exited permanent supportive housing in 2018 and returned to homelessness when they exited, they're still showing as a negative outcome, even though I'm not including the year 2018. Again, probably a pretty simple fix in the calculations, but just haven't had time to do it. What to do next? So there are clearly some programs where we have found that there are inequitable outcomes based on different demographic criteria. And so we're currently in the process of figuring out what's next on addressing those outcomes. And while we don't know, and we can't prescribe anything for your agency, one thing that we've found during this process is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when inequities are found. The potential solutions that we are currently pursuing are policy changes, training and education, but I feel a lot of times training and education is maybe a first step that people go towards when it actually becomes a way of distracting us from doing the work of changing the way we operate, right? Just having another diversity and inclusion training probably isn't going to fix inequitable outcomes in your programs. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. We need to communicate our findings to the frontline staff. So it's easy for leadership to want to hold on to these and maybe not tell someone, because it doesn't make everyone feel great about the work that they do. I think a lot of us are proud of the work that we do, but it's also important that we're willing to look at the places that we may be falling short. And where sample sizes might be incredibly small, say for people who are transgender or gender nonconforming, where we in a year do not serve more than 30 people who are of a gender minority, opening or strengthening a participant feedback system and some kind of qualitative data analysis and collection is definitely an important part of addressing these kind of issues. So that's what we did for our data and equity dashboard. And that's my presentation. Any questions?
That was wonderful. Thank you.
I don't have any questions, but yeah, I really enjoyed looking at that and your thought process through it all. And I think it's important conversations for all of us to have and to look into our data to see where those inequities are happening, because I think you're right. You don't want to highlight, if there's some issues and come to terms with that, but it could be that we're not even aware that that's happening in our system, and being informed is the most powerful tool we can have. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and piggybacking on what Rose just said, I absolutely appreciate the presentation and definitely got my wheels turning, and want to do something similar just to see, it's something we should all be looking into and making sure we're not inadvertently steering people, or whatever the term might be used, to properly suggest why inequity is happening. But great presentation. Thank you, Connor.
Thanks, y'all. I do want to say too, we are trying to be as fully transparent in this process as we can be with everybody in the community. And as part of that, if anyone has questions on performing similar analysis for your agency, please send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat box. I'm willing to share our findings, our data, obviously in a de-identified way. And I can also share my Tableau workbook so that you don't have to build one from scratch. You can just upload your data into it if you use Tableau.
That'd be really cool. Thank you.
That's the biggest win of the day.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Connor.
So I did want to ask the group, racial inequity is part of the COC application that we have to submit to HUD on an annual basis. And so over the past couple of years, we've been pulling data at a COC level, but we would like to be able to look at this more regularly, rather than just, once a year reporting to HUD and moving on with our lives. So I guess my question for the group is, if this is something that you're interested in seeing, if yes, is it like at an agency level or a COC level or a project level, and kind of how you would use that information?
Do we have to pick just one?
No, I mean, whatever your initial thoughts are, because it's pretty, it's in its infancy right now.
I think for me, a starting point would be agency level, because I would love to see, kind of partner with you all to see how our agency is doing, and then build up to kind of more broader views.
Yeah, same. I mean, things like this are really hard to start from scratch. So if we have a little bit of a starting point, I think that'll be really great. And in regards to how we would use it, I mean, similarly to what Connor was saying, if we're seeing poor outcomes of, the people that we're serving and their successes, that definitely is something that we need to look at internally.
And Aaron, you said that you have been reporting this to HUD. Have you observed any COC across the board inequities that we may need to address?
There was a little bit. I'm trying to remember now. It seemed like Asians were more likely or less likely in. I know that Black African Americans had lower rates of success than other groups. And I thought Asians had higher rates, but I'm not sure about that. But yes, there was a little bit of discrepancy between the different groups, as well as because we're not only looking at exits to permanent housing, we were also looking at just the homeless population. And I think that's what it was. I think Asians were less likely to be homeless than other groups. And then Black African Americans had less successful exits to permanent housing.
I
That
think
sounds accurate.
To know exactly where these prejudices and biases are manifesting themselves, and especially across different types of programs. For instance, if it was a street outreach program, or if it was something that was very heavily landlord oriented, like a scattered site permanent supportive housing type of program, that would be very interesting to see where those biases are manifesting themselves, to see if it's an issue within the agency itself, or do we need to rethink who we're partnering with?
That's a very excellent point.
Okay, so we will start thinking about this. I don't know that it's going to be next month that we have something for the group, but we will start trying to come up with a way for all of you to be able to see this information more regularly. Any other thoughts or anything else you would want to see on this before we move on? All right, so thank you, Connor. I think everybody really liked it. It was good to see your noodle working. All right, let me share my screen again. So our last topic is the Homeless Prevention Project performance reports that were published, I believe it was yesterday. So I'll go over the goals and outcomes report, but really quickly, just wanted to remind everyone that if you haven't already seen it, we do also have project level scores for each measure. So please check those out if you haven't already. Also wanted to briefly mention on this first screen here, so this is the goals and outcomes report. You'll see some of these measures have some discrepancies and kind of big changes between this reporting period and the previous reporting period. And the reason for that is because we have a lot more prevention projects participating in HMIS now than we did a year ago when we did this last time. I want to say it's over double the number of projects. So, which is great. We're getting funding for that, and it's something that's needed. And I think a lot of that has to do with COVID. But no matter what the reason, it's great that we're increasing those projects. So this report is looking at calendar year 2020. And we do have 5 measures for prevention, which you can see here how we're doing overall. I was surprised to see, well, let me start by saying, with the addition of new projects, I think that the data that we're seeing now is a little more accurate, I think, than it's been in the past, because the universe of clients included in these measures has gone up a lot. So for example, for goal 6, stayers who maintained or increased their income was only 25%, and now it's 88%. I think there was like 20 or 30 clients included in this first measure, and in the report we just did, it's a much higher number now. So I think that these measures are also a little bit more accurate in terms of how the prevention projects are working in Orange County. I did want to really quickly look at leavers with increased income, because for both reporting periods, we are well over our threshold of 35%. We had 83% last time and 87% this time. And I wanted to quickly ask the group if there was an interest in increasing this threshold, maybe to 40%, to continue to try to improve the work that we're doing on this measure. Any thoughts on that?
I wonder, my only thought is that some of us have extremely temporary funding that is now part of this pool with the COVID funding. As far as we know, it's not renewable and it's ending soon. And what would these numbers look like if we took out even just the COVID specific temporary fundings? And would that be a more realistic long-term look at the numbers?
Yeah, that's a fair point. We did not pull out the COVID specific ones, but we can wait to increase the threshold until that funding has ended, and we're looking at more like the ongoing consistent prevention projects. Yeah,
we have some ending this June and then some ending in 2022. So it'll be a little bit of time, but it's not a long term either.
Yeah, okay.
I think there is a lot of funding earmarked in Biden's new bill that's being passed for homeless services, specifically in regard to wrap-through housing and homeless prevention, but again, temporary.
Erin, I just have a quick question about goal 3, because I see that that's the only one that we didn't meet. And just speaking like from our experience at the FSC and the 2 projects that we have for prevention, I know that that's a 60-day or less enrollment in the project. And I can just speak from our experience, like part of the reason why we didn't meet this goal, it was also the only one that we didn't meet for our projects, is because with up to 3 months of assistance. And so I think that probably, and maybe the rest of the group can speak to this also, who are getting prevention funding as well right now, that for COVID are seeing that prevention funding kind of be flexible in the amount of time that people can be served in the project. So maybe just like, I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing that we haven't met it. I do just kind of think that it's kind of just changes that we've seen with the funding and what's allowed.
Yeah, we experienced the same thing. A lot of our funding is short to medium term rental assistance for homeless prevention. We can go to up to 6 months on some of those. So we are, if the families need the rental assistances, we're not going to meet that objective.
So are a lot of the new funding sources for prevention 6 months assistance?
Most of them for us are 3 months. I don't know about everyone else. Generally
for us.
But we can go higher than that for a specific grouping of the funding source. But I would say an average is 3.
Okay, because that was one of the things I wanted to talk about for goal 3. Because you can see that we've got just as many people from 61 to 180 days as we did for 60 days or less. So yeah, that would make sense that if a lot of the new funding is 90 days or maybe even more, why we're seeing that many clients here. So thanks for sharing. That does provide some context on that.
In full transparency though, I will add some of it is training also of when to exit your families. Like we all kind of got rushed with this funding and we had to serve and try to hire our staff at the same time. And I think now we're getting to a point where we can evaluate what areas from data that we need to focus on and learn from this last pandemic year. So some of those are our own errors as well. I want to be fair.
And I did, and in looking at the data, this was the goal that was the most difficult for all the projects to meet. So it sounds like it's a combination of both the allowances of the funding as well as maybe some issues around the exiting. We have been trying to kind of standardize that as much as possible on our side. Is there more clarification that you need from us on when people should be exited, or is it more specific to your funding?
I think we got it now. We scared our team with this report. I think it's more of we kind of got rushed with calls of needing support and funding that unfortunately some of the follow through on when they should exit and certain things like that were not top of mind because we had too much inflow of requests for support and not enough staff support because we were also trying to hire at the same time. So now we're all scared. We're all back on track. We all understand the impact of the work that we do. Plus, we our ability to serve is not aligned with the measure at this time.
Not to call on you, Rose, but how did you scare them? In a positive way.
Yeah. So I sent, we had a quick chat after this was published, and I sent them to my, the family navigators. And I said, anything in red, which they said it was pink, but I said it was red because that was reminds me of my old days in data. I was like, anything in red means that we didn't do what we were supposed to do. And kind of just shared, we're going to be taking a look at the data, which we did thanks to ISIS. She pulled information for us. So we had exact information. And we just went ahead and said, look at everyone that's open more than 90 days. Since we know that our average is 90 days of rental assistance, we went to every single person that had a client open more than 90 days, and they shouldn't have been. So they had that direct conversation with their manager.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. I'm wondering if other projects are doing that, or because that's kind of hard. We would like to be able to support in that, but that's not necessarily something we know because we don't know the ins and outs of your contracts or those types of requirements. I don't know if we could write a guidance document on you should, look at this and compare it to this, or if that would be helpful, or if you guys kind of know what you're doing.
Well, for Families Forward, this influx of homeless prevention funds is new. So we're learning alongside kind of this process. One of the things that we had requested from our own data team is if we can have a monthly report that just gives the manager how many clients are open more than 90 days. We do that with some of our rapid rehousing goals and objectives too, how many have been looking for housing for more than 30 days. And so we're just learning how to implement our own tracking mechanisms. And that's kind of one of the first ones we're going to implement, how many were open more than 90 days. And then our manager can review those when they're doing case conferencing with their team.
Okay. Any other, I saw Stephanie put in a income thing, but any other comments or questions on the length of time before we move on? Okay, so measure 6. This is the measure that had the big increase since the last time we ran this. So this is looking at adults who maintained or increased their income and were still enrolled in the project at the end of the reporting period. So the number of clients included in this measure is really small because they have to be enrolled for over a year, and usually that's not what's happening with prevention. And you can see most of the clients maintain their income since the goal of prevention is to keep people in housing, not necessarily to increase their income. So that was why we allowed this measure to be either maintained or increased. Stephanie asked what type of income was increased. So we didn't look ourselves at the type of income to increase, but for the agencies, are you inputting, like if they're getting a stimulus check or any other kind of COVID relief, are you putting that income into HMIS, or is it more ongoing income?
Can I speak?
Yeah.
Okay. For us, unemployment is considered income, and that with the stimulus, each stimulus, for example, when it was the 400 per month and the 600 per month, that was included in that because they received it for several months, and now we have another wave coming in. So that's why I was asking if it was UI related, because that would explain why there was a big jump in a short period of time. And granted, now that you said that it's only for those enrolled in a year or more, that really is kind of a moot point, because typically prevention doesn't have clients enrolled that long. But I was just curious about that, because that would seem how they would increase their income to that degree. Why you would exceed that goal is because of the UI and the stimulus money attached to all the UI.
Yeah. And so this is looking at any type of income. That for sure could be it. We're just looking to see like the dollar amount they had at entry and the dollar amount they had in their latest assessment, and whether that went up, stayed the same, or went down. So that's how we're calculating it.
Income from all sources, right? That's what you just said?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
And then Stephanie, Christine put a question in, and maybe you can share how you're doing this. How are staff getting this data from their clients if they are not self-reporting the increase in unemployment income or a stimulus check?
We require a screenshot from their UI paychecks. We require documentation to substantiate their income verification, because most of the COVID related grants you have to verify their income in some way. It's only a small percent, at least with our grants, are self-certification.
And just to add really quickly to that, for all of our prevention projects from FSC, we also look at bank statements, because sometimes that can also lead to other income sources that are maybe like recurring payments from a family member or something that they get every single month or something like that. So that's just one other way that, we, at least on our side, also look at income as well.
And when you have a COVID trigger, the UI can be a COVID trigger, documentation for a COVID trigger, depending on when they first applied for UI, which a screenshot from their homepage of their UI account essentially substantiates that. So, because not everybody gets a letter from their employer about their furlough or layoff. Some of them don't, whatever. And the UI essentially can substantiate that and verify their income. And sometimes bank statements, if we absolutely cannot get anything, but the bank statements for us have to be, deposits, income has to be decreased after COVID than before COVID, the amount of total deposits. So, bank statements are that's our last option, is bank statements.
All right, I'm gonna move on to the next measure since it's also income related. So this is adults that maintained or increased their income as of project exit. And so you can see again, the large majority of clients have maintained their income, and then there was a few increased income. Yeah, that was the main thing I want to bring up on this one. Any comments or questions on income before we move on? Christine's digging the income tips in the chat. All right, next measure is looking at exits to successful housing situations. So for permanent housing, this is exits I'm sorry, for homeless prevention, this is exits to permanent housing. And this is generally a measure that the COC is pretty good at meeting because they are already in housing and it's just maintaining that housing for them. So you can see that across all of the subpopulation categories. And for those that did not exit to permanent housing, the majority of those, the destination is missing. And so I wanted to ask the group, for prevention, are these clients just like, how is this working? If you know where they're living, how is this income or the exit information missing? Are they being evicted and then they don't want to talk to you, or kind of how is that occurring?
Is that no exit interview completed?
Yes, it would be in there.
We had a couple of our team members lose contact with their clients. Mainly our fault. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we were overwhelmed with requests and funding and couldn't keep up with our follow-up calls. So our team lost contact with families. They did get their funding. Then after that, they didn't really need to talk to us anymore. So if we were a little bit late, they weren't so inclined. But I did have some conversations with our HUD rep about exits and kind of got some advice to really consider the last known location based on the last time you were able to connect with your family. Where were they? What was their location? What was their status? And taking that into consideration. So we applied a little bit of that information into how we did our exits. But we did have some loose contact as well.
So it sounds like the guidance you received was that if you provided them the funding and then lost contact with them, you can make a reasonable assumption that they were still where you left them as of the last time you talked to them.
Yeah, like if we provided rental assistance today, the 11th, got all of the documentation, cut the check today, and by the 17th, we needed to connect with them so we could do the exit documentation, see how they're doing, everything go okay. Did the landlord receive the check? And they didn't reply. Sometimes we were reaching out to the landlord to just get a new ledger to make sure everything cleared, and then we could do our exit.
Okay, great. All right. Last measure. So this is looking at clients that were placed in permanent housing from the prevention project, and then they later returned to the homeless system. So this is pretty much the same thing as the returns to homelessness measure. It's just worded a little bit differently because if they're in prevention, they aren't homeless at the moment. So the returns is pretty consistent across all of the different household and subpopulation types. It was kind of interesting to me that most of the clients that are returning to the system are returning to prevention. And I think we kind of talked about this before. But yes, almost 90% of the clients returning to the system are returning to prevention. Is that something that you all have experienced, and are you serving them with the same project or another project, and kind of how is that working?
We are seeing that. We are doing, like, for example, we're close to South County Outreach and FAM, and a lot of times, a lot of the same people are calling us. We're working to dedupe our services, but also we can pay for different months because the pandemic lasted a lot longer than anybody anticipated. And if they were helped one time with Families Forward, doesn't mean they don't need help several months after from maybe South County outreach. Sometimes we'll try to do like, if we served them with our CDBG COVID grant, then maybe South County Outreach will serve them with their ESG grant. So we will try to pick different funding types. And we're coordinating that together. So we're meeting monthly so we can make sure that we're not deduping services, but also checking our HMIS enrollments to know that we're not deduping any of those services. But we can serve the same families.
Just to add to that, I know anecdotally there are instances where clients have needed extra assistance. For instance, if there was an ESG funded homeless prevention program and a regular ESG funded homeless prevention program, and this person was in the same city, we would transfer them over from one program to another if they needed extra assistance.
Also, just one other thing is that kind of expanding a little bit more on what Rose said was that, you know, up until really this a month ago, or maybe even a month and a half ago at this point, like ERA funding wasn't really around. And so a lot of the projects that we have seen this past year weren't equipped to pay out such, you know, so many months that these families or households were behind in rent. And so I think it kind of was a community effort for a lot of us to keep these families housed, and really was one of those ways that we collaborated to help make sure that just because we helped families with 1 or 2 or 3 months, if they were still behind, we still wanted to leave them in a good spot and would make referrals to other places, because of course this was before we knew ERA was coming and could help with up to $10,000. So that's part of it too. Another thing also is that we kind of were able to be flexible, thankful to like our funders and the county and everyone, where we did have these different grants with where when COVID hit, they did allow us to help with more than 1 month. And so families who we had already exited prior back in 2019 came back and asked for additional assistance, and we were thankfully able to provide it to them. So that also would have counted as one of those returns to the system as well.
And this is kind of showing that prevention is doing what it's supposed to be doing, because you're trying to keep the client in their housing. You know, you provide them the assistance you can, and then they're returning to prevention again, which means they are still in their housing. They may be struggling, but they are still in that housing. So that's kind of a positive way to look at it also. And then the last thing, so for those that are returning to the homeless system or entering the homeless system after exiting to permanent housing, this is showing where their initial exit was to. And almost all the clients were exited to somewhere they owned or rented with no subsidy, which also makes sense with the type of project this is, since you're trying to keep them in their existing housing. And then some stayed where they were, but with a subsidy, and then some moved in with family or friends permanently. Any other thoughts or questions on this measure?
Can I ask a clarifying question? So that homeless prevention, return to a homeless prevention, does that count against the measure?
So for this measure was kind of a local COC decision. So yes, it is, those returns to prevention are included in here. But homeless prevention is not included in like the system performance report that we do to HUD. So that this data isn't like harming our performance at all. It's just it was a local decision to look at this data, and we decided to include returns to prevention in that.
Okay.
Any other thoughts, comments, questions before we wrap up?
Yes, sorry. I always have so many questions. I'm sorry, Erin.
No problem, Rose.
In the beginning, when we were talking about the goal of days in a homeless prevention program, is that a community level measure, or is that something that is, sorry, I need to formulate my question before.
Really, this homeless prevention isn't included in any of the reports to HUD. So everything in this report was determined at a local level
Okay.
as items that were important to look at for prevention.
Okay, because I was just like, we're not going to improve that one, at least not at our agency, until, you know, some of our COVID funding, well, even after that, our non-COVID funding is 3 consecutive months of assistance. So if we keep the measure at 60 days, I don't foresee us meeting that, and I don't know what that means.
Yeah, don't tell anybody, but it doesn't really mean anything other than, because we're not submitting this data to HUD, this is just locally, how are we performing and are we improving? And so the thresholds were created to help gauge that. But yes, if you have up to 90 days to serve someone and you're not meeting the 60-day threshold, then that makes sense and that's okay. The thresholds were more general for the COC as a whole. And so, you know, as long as you know what you're doing and you maybe your average days is 90 days and you're right where you need to be. Anything else? Well, thank you guys so much for your participation today. As you saw, Connor really got to wild out today. So if any of you have anything that you want to present on, let me know, and I'm happy to let you wild out on your own thing. But the next meeting is scheduled for April 8th. We will send out the recording from this meeting as well as some brief minutes. And see you guys next month, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.